Hello, this is Marissa Harayo. Welcome to my channel, Marissa Harayo. Ngayon, magluluto po tayo ng isdang paksiw. Paksiw na isda dito sa Saudi Arabia. Ngayon, kung hindi pa po kayo nakapag-subscribe sa channel ko, please subscribe and click the notification bell para po updated po kayo sa mga incoming ko na videos. There down below, please click the notification bell. Ngayon magluluto tayo ng isdang paksiw. Okay, here we go. Ayan, kukunin na po natin yung isda kung saan ito po yung fridge namin, punong-puno. Bless na bless po yung freezer namin. Daming saan na yung isda ko? Uy, bumalik na dun sa dagat yata. Wait lang po ha, kukunin ko lang po yung isda. Ito na yung isda. Babad muna natin sa tubig. Kasi sobrang tigas. Yan. Babad muna natin sa tubig. Tapos nung ibabad, magpe-prepare muna tayo sa mga kakailanganin. Ito po yung gas range, electric stove. Dito ako magluluto sa paksiw. Ayan. Hugasan ko pa po yung isda, lilinisan, tapos mag-prepare po ng bawang, sibuyas. Ito yung bawang, tapos sibuyas. Oh no! Imbes na tingnan nyo, lagyan na Nescafe pero yung laman bitin at saka salt. Yan. Habang naghihintay po tayo na lumambot yung isda kasi lilinisan ko pa, hihiwa muna ako ng sibuyas at saka bawang. No.
Oh, he tried it.
Yung hihiwa lang, guys.
Oh!
Kita nyo ba? Hihiwa po ako ng sibuyas at saka bawang.
No.
Ito na lang pang hiwa nyo. Gusto nyo malaki yung hiwa.
He tried it.
Tapos,
Oh!
kalahati lang ang ilagay ko kasi sobrang malaki naman yung ito. Kahit anong style nyo sa paghiwa ng sibuyas, okay lang yan. Yan. Tapos, bawang natin. Gamit lang din ako ng 6 na piraso. Kung malalaki, 6 na piraso. Yan. Wait lang guys ha. Ayan, kita niyo ba yung bawang? Ito. Ayan. Ganito ako ng bawang para madali siyang balatan. Kita niyo? Bilis lang po balatan. Yan, tapos na. Tapos, gusto nyong hiwain to maliliit. Kahit anong forma, kahit anong size na gusto nyo, bilang yan. Isda. Ayan. Ayan, isda.
Years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, 7.
Tanghalian ng mga kasama ko. Yung akin kanin, tapos yung kanin ko, yan, iinitin ko.
1 debt to society later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later.
Hintayin po natin
Epilogue.
na maluto.
The next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 3 days later, opening night. Later, 3,000 years later. 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later. The following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, later in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later!
80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. Later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later.